Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to my August reading wrap-up. Usually I combine months for my wrap-ups, but in this case I read more than 10 books, so I thought may as well do it in 1 month's wrap-up. So let's get into what I read first. Also, any of the videos that I mention in here I will link below. The first book I read this month was actually a reread, and it's The Words of Radiance by Sanderson, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars and I loved it. I have a vlog and a spoiler-free review for these, and obviously a review for the first book as well, but this really built on the characters that we already know and loved in the first book. This had like a pinnacle point of action as well, and it was a very fast moving book in comparison to Way of Kings, because the way that I understand it is that the Way of Kings sets everything up, and obviously there is action in that book as well, but this, because we already know all the characters, it just has a faster track of action in it at multiple points rather than at 1 or 2, just like in the Way of Kings. So I loved it. I love the characters, and I can't believe how much detail I missed with the characters and the world building and the mental health. The first time I read this I clocked it, but I didn't really sink into it. So now I am realizing a lot more on my rereads and I'm loving it. And obviously after The Rhythm of War comes out in November, I'm going to reread this series at some point again and no doubt clock even more stuff that I missed the first 2 times I read it. So this was an easy 5 out of 5 stars for me. The Stormlight Archive is one of my most favorite series ever. And then predictably, I also read Oathbringer by Sanderson, and I read this in my Tome Topple reading vlog. So the Tome Topple is when you have to read books that are 500 pages or over. There are a whole bunch of reading challenges, and this one satisfied one of those challenges. So I managed to finish like 1,300 pages of this beast, and I also gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I don't really know what to say because I need to talk spoiler free, and a lot of my thoughts hinge on spoilers. So I will keep very, very brief with a spoiler free review that I will link in the cards. But I, again, love the development of these characters. This is a very character focused book in terms of it goes into Dalinar's backstory. So you see why he is feared as the Blackthorn, and in the past he was a tyrant and in the present he is not. So you find out why there's a disparity between the 2 parts of his identity, I guess, and it also delves more into the Radiance and the magic system, and it also delves into the characters and mental health, as the first 2 books have done as well. So I love this series so much, and it's bringing such a scope to the world building in this book, and I love seeing all of that unfurl too, because while I read it the first time around, I didn't have enough brain capacity to understand a lot of it because I was too focused on what the characters were doing and what the plot was doing. But now that I've reread it and I've rediscovered all of the world building that Sanderson is doing, I'm even more excited for Rhythm of War because he is going to make that book spectacular. I just know it. So this was another 5 out of 5 stars. Pretty easy to tell. I give Sanderson's books usually a 4 or 5 stars, and this was definitely a 5. Surprisingly, the next book I read is not a fantasy and it's not a sci-fi. It's not really to my taste, but I bought it like 3 years ago and then I kind of hid it on my shelves, and it's A Little Life by Hanya Youngahira, and I have finally read this now, and I would be very, very hesitant in saying read this book. I actually probably wouldn't recommend it because of the way that it portrays such harmful topics and harmful actions. So this is a very dark book, and I would suggest looking up all of the trigger warnings before going into it, because it's not a book of salvation. It's very much a book of characters going into a deep dark hole and then not digging themselves out, and it's done very purposefully in that fashion. So just know that going in, it's not a book that inspires hope in any means. So this follows 4 characters, and they are Jude, JB, Willem and Michael, and they all meet in college and they form a very close friendship with each other, and it's about the relationship between these characters spanning a few decades because they meet in their 20s. So you see that, I guess, journey, for lack of a better word. And I found that while a lot of people read this book and cried, I read this book and felt heavy and felt sad, but I didn't cry. So it didn't hit me in the same way that it might have hit other people, but I did feel the heaviness, and I had to take a day or 2 off reading after I finished this just so I could collect myself and then move on to the next book. So it did leave an impact on me and my reading experience. Overall, it was just descriptive. It was emotive. I cared about all of the characters. I think they were all set up very, very well, but the way that it ended and the way that the events turned out, it just felt like I was set up to love these characters at the beginning, and then I was emotionally manipulated into the fact that none of them were going to have a positive outlook on life, and it all went into a deep dark tunnel after that with no light at the end. So there was 1 or 2 things that I saw coming, but I think they were intentional, like they were set up for you to see coming. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I couldn't give it a 5 because I don't know if I want to say I enjoyed this book, because that's not the right word to use at all, but it did obviously leave an impact on me, and while it frustrated me at some parts, I liked others, and I think it had a very conscious way of setting things up in the plot. So it didn't lack pacing, it didn't lack description, and it didn't didn't lack character building and plot development, so I can't really make it like a 2 or 3 stars. And I did like it in the way it conveyed everything, but it was quite dark. There are very, very graphic scenes in here, and I could talk about this book for a long time, but I talked about it spoiler free in a vlog, so you can see my progressive thoughts about it. So if you want to know more, then I'd suggest looking at that vlog, because I get quite in depth with my different feelings at different points in reading it. But yeah, 4 out of 5 stars. I'm glad I finally finished it. This is like a relief, because this has been on my to be read pile for so long, and I've mentioned it in so many different videos, but I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it only because it's so dark and you've got to know exactly what you're in for before you read it, and I don't have any triggers, and it still left a big impact on me. So just be wary going into this, but I think I did like it. I think I liked it. 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to an audiobook, and I don't know why I procrastinated this so long when I know that this series brings me so much joy, and it's Summer Night by Jim Butcher. This is the 4th Dresden Files book, and I don't want to talk about this too much because obviously spoilers, but I have a playlist for all of Dresden reviews on my channel, so I'll link that down below. But this follows Dresden when he gets stuck between the 2 Fae courts because of the murder of the Summer Knight, who is like the left hand of the Summer Queen's court. And after this proposition, after he gets kind of blackmailed, he also runs into people that are from his past, and then there are repercussions of the book before this kind of bleeding over into this book as well. And Dresden is experiencing a lot of hurt and a lot of grief, and you get to see that explored through Murphy, one of the characters in here. And I love the way that this book was consistent. I love the way that it had follow through. I love the way that it was also hilarious in parts, and I was laughing out loud. And honestly, reading Dresden, like I said, just brings me so much joy. This was no different to that, and I just adored it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I am big into this series now, and I'm definitely continuing. So Summer Night was no different. 5 out of 5 stars. I am loving this series. Next up, I read a little bit of a hyped book, and it's The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, and I thought I would give this a 5 out of 5 stars, but I actually gave it a 3 out of 5. And that is because it felt like, even though this was enjoyable, it had a lot going on in it, and I found it very busy. So in this book, don't read too many synopses, because I read the synopses on Goodreads and it kind of spoiled the beginning, because it takes about, I'd say about 150 to 200 pages to set this story up and to set Tao and his trajectory. And so when I knew this spoiler, it ruined the setup of the book. So Tao is on a revenge quest, and there are lots of training montages in here, but because he had like this single-minded focus, he didn't really develop beyond that point, and he kind of stayed the same throughout the entire book. And I'm somebody who loves characters, and if you can't develop your character in a conceivable way that I will empathize with them, and if they just stay kind of the same throughout the book, it's a little bit boring to me and a little bit lackluster. And I liked the world building that this set up. I liked that the women in here were the ones who were the gifted, and that they could enrage, which is like to connect to dragons. And there was a whole bunch of other class stuff, politics stuff, and world building stuff that was also being explored alongside the magic system in here. But because Tao was so single-minded, because it wasn't multiple perspective, and because it took so long to set things up at the start, I found I was disconnecting from it a little bit. And the training montages were really cool, and I love battle and stuff in books I read, but in between I kind of wanted more character development, and that didn't really happen to the extent that I wanted. So I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't connect to the battles at the beginning because I didn't know the characters yet, so I didn't care. I didn't have any emotional stakes in those battles. So it had a bit of a slippery start for me because I couldn't really grasp onto it. And then Tao didn't really change. And then the side characters I was interested enough in, but I wasn't emotionally impacted by what happened to them either. So that's why this is only getting a 3 stars. It is a book that has a lot of potential for the sequel. So I don't know if I'm going to read the sequel at this point, but it is a possibility I'm considering. So I gave this 3. It was a hyped book, and I don't usually read hyped up books because usually I get too excited about them and then I read them and then this happens. I give it a 3. So it was enjoyable, but not a new favorite. Next up, I actually read an ebook, which is quite surprising because I'm not usually an ebook person, but this is a book that is set after The Song Rising but before The Mask Falling by Samantha Shannon, and it's called The Dawn Chorus. And this follows Paige on the back of experiencing a lot of pain physically, and that has an impact on her mental health. So you see her exploring and experiencing her trauma from the things that happened in the previous book. And I'm trying to talk about The Dawn Chorus without spoiling anything that's happened before it, so bear with me if I sound a little bit cryptic. But I really liked the relationship in here. I love the consent in this book, and I love that we get to see the emotional and mental impact rather than the character just glossing over it and being not fine in the next book but functional in the next book. So this was a really good middle chunk that really developed characters, because if I'm reading a novella in between a series, I expect it to do something, and this definitely did something with its characters, and it made me a lot more emotionally invested in them now, because I haven't read this series in a while and I was planning on doing a reread, but apparently there is like a glossary in The Mask Falling with all the characters and all of the description that you need in order to read the book coming out. So I don't think I'm going to have to do a reread, but it was nice to revisit these characters and reconnect with them in the Dawn Chorus. This was a terrifying little novella in the way that it developed character. I just really felt for them. I felt their terror. It was really honest and vulnerable as well, and I love how fragile these characters were with each other. And so I gave it 5 out of 5 stars because it made me tear up at different points, and I think it was just a very, very careful and well done little installment in between a series. So I really liked this. And then next I read another audiobook, and that is The Book of Etta by Meg Ellison, and this is the second book to her Road to Nowhere series. The first book is The Book of the Unnamed Midwife, and I read that in February and I gave it 5 stars because it was a newly discovered queer apocalyptic book, and it was quiet but very character deep, and I loved it. And I didn't quite love The Book of Etta as much, but I liked it enough to give it a 4 stars. So the first book is apocalyptic in the sense that a pandemic has just swept the globe. There is a very high death rate, and this one character who is a midwife gets the virus, survives, and now she's got to survive in this world that has a low rate of women surviving, so she's got to disguise herself as a man to get by. And because the virus has just happened, it's a world that is just on the cusp of becoming apocalyptic, so there's still stuff that we relate to in this world that our character has to let go of. And the Book of Etta is not like that. The Book of Etta is years after the Book of the Unnamed Midwife. So it's already setting up like new trade. It's setting up new little towns every now and then. It's setting up new enemies. And I like all of those things that it set up. But I didn't love the fact that while it was character driven, which is what I tend to gravitate towards and I love, it didn't have too much of a plot. And so it felt a little bit loose. And I liked Etta enough on her deep character exploration to like the story, and I was compelled to read the third book and finish the trilogy. I don't know really how to describe it, but I definitely like the first book better, and I think it's just because of the format of the first book, because I think I like fairly new apocalyptic books, not post-apocalyptic books, if that makes sense. Or at least in this case I didn't, because while it had dangers in it, it didn't have them on a grander scale like Book of the Unnamed Midwife. I think that's what I mean, but I definitely like the first book better. I don't know how to describe it, and this is a wrap up, so shame on me. I haven't really said much about the Book of Etta because obviously of spoilers, I don't want to say what happens, but this is a direct sequel rather than a companion. I think in the past I thought they might be a companion series, but they're not. But the Book of Etta follows Etta at the beginning of the book, and it opens with her disguised as a man out in the wild, and she's on the road and she's making a trade with these 2 slavers for this 5-year-old girl, presumably to take the girl back to the town that she lives in to treat her medically and to rehabilitate her, I guess. So that's what the first little scene is about, and that's one of the scenes that made me tear up because of the emotional impact of it. So it started really, really strong, but it kind of drifted a little bit, and then it had peaks in it, and then the ending was okay. So I think I liked the first book better because it kept me interested in like a bang, bang, bang way during the plot. But anyway, the Book of Etta was 4 out of 5 stars, and then I read afterwards on audiobook The Book of Flora. And then like the Book of Etta, I wanted this to have more push and more plot, and I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I did really like Flora's voice though, and she is a trans woman, by the way, so if you're looking for trans characters, I believe that Meg Ellison uses she, they pronouns. So I believe this is an Own Voices apocalyptic series. It just fell down a little bit with the plot for me because I wanted a little bit more than it gave me. I said in my notes that when the action picked up, I was like, ooh, 4 stars. And then it died down again and I was like, oh, 3.5. So it did hold my attention, but it had less plot than Book of Etta and then the first book. So that's why I could only give it 3.5 stars. I did like it, but I think I wish I just stuck with the first book because I like the formula for that one the most out of all 3. And then next I've actually got a DNF, and it is Spark by Rachel Craw, and I'm DNFing this just because I think that I've grown out of it because I bought this years ago, and this is a young adult like urban fantasy because it has our main character named Evie, and she starts to experience these weird powers, and then somebody in the plot acts as like the mentor character, which I tend to love that trope, but the way that it was done was just very dialogue, very info dumpy heavy, and it had a lot of jargon that kind of got dropped in my lap, and I wasn't as interested in it because of that reason. It didn't seamlessly, or it didn't weave it into the story the way I wanted it to, and I was kind of rolling my eyes at the heavy-handedness of it. So because of that, I ended up not finishing this. I got 155 pages in, but I just think it's really not for me. Even though I like the writing, I just didn't like the way that it did things. I didn't like the execution, I think is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I think I would have loved this as a teen, like I said, but it just came unstuck when it got to the world building in here. So that's why I ended up DNFing it. Next up, I'm really proud of myself because this is a TBR veteran for me. I've had this since I was 17 and I'm 27 now, and it's A Lion Called Christian. And this is actually from a YouTube video or a YouTube documentary or sensation, because this is a non-fiction book. So this really happened, and it's about these two men in the 70s and they adopt a lion cub called Christian, and it really follows their story. So I was really worried when listening to this audiobook that this would go down the unhealthy route, but they actually did the best they could for this lion, and it actually worked out in a way that I was really respectful of. So I gave it 4 stars because I liked the way that it was narrated, I liked the story, and I liked the way that the message was conveyed in here about exotic animals and about taking care of animals the best that they need it rather than the best that you want them to have, rather than your interests being first. I mean, they put the animals' interests and the animals' needs first, which is what I really respected. So I really liked this, and I actually got this as a gift from my English teacher when I was 17, and she wrote a little note in it saying, "To Rebecca, because of your love of animals, enjoy." So that was just lovely, and now I have this as like a memento of my high school days, which is really nice. Next up, I have another little DNF, and I mentioned this very, very briefly at the beginning of a vlog that I filmed recently, but this is The Heart Forger. I've mentioned this and The Shadow Glass in a few other videos as like to be read videos, but I've actually realized that I need to reread the entire first book before I can dive into the second and third. So I'm DNFing this series for now, but not forever. I have actually got the audiobooks on Audible because there was a deal on that had the whole series for free. So lucky me, you can listen to all of the audiobooks for this series in the future. So that is what I'm going to do with this series. If you didn't know, it's about a bone witch. She accidentally resurrects her brother from the dead, and with these necromancy powers, she gets taken to like a geisha kind of school and trained in them. So that is the premise for The Bone Witch, the first book. Obviously there's a whole lot of other stuff going on, but that is the very bare bones of what you need to know. So I like this series. I gave the first book 4 stars, and I've just forgotten so much that I couldn't continue on conceivably to the second book. So I definitely need to reread, and that's what I'm going to do. So this series for now is parked until 2021, and hopefully I will listen to the whole thing then. And then next up, I read a bunch of manga. So I finished the Fruits Basket series, which is something that's been very nostalgic for me, and I'll just run through the ratings and then give a quick overview. So volume 9 for me was a 3 out of 5 stars. Volume 10 was a 4 out of 5 stars. Volume 11 was a 5 out of 5 stars, and this is like the pinnacle of where the series coalesces, and this is where all the payoff for all of the build-up happens. Even though this is the second last volume, everything seemed to happen in here. And then volume 12 I gave a 4 out of 5 stars, and like I said, everything happened in the previous volume, but this one was more like a wrapping up volume. You got the pinnacle of the story, and now you've had a "and this is where they are now" kind of reaction. I love this series for the emotive value that it gives me. There is so much anguish and there is so much vulnerability and sadness in here, and honestly I just want to take all of these characters and put them into therapy because they seem to really need it. And I didn't like a particular storyline in here with a relationship. I found it inconsistent because it hadn't really shown in the series before that point, so it seemed unrealistic to me and kind of just convenient. A lot of characters in here seemed to kind of pair off at the end, and usually that's something I hate because I cared about all these characters and I knew all of them so well. It didn't really bother me that much except for that one relationship that I mentioned. Obviously I'm not going to say who because it's a massive spoiler. I think that's all I really have to say about the series, except that volume 11 was by far my favorite. I liked that it left me feeling emotional, but it didn't make me cry, and I thought this series on a reread would make me cry, and it didn't. Maybe the anime will, but I think because I remembered the last panel of the manga all of those years ago since I read it. So because I knew how it ended and I knew the emotive way that it finished, I didn't cry because I knew how it ended. So I liked this series. I'm really happy that I reread it. Like I said, it's vulnerable, it's heartfelt. Sometimes the characters were a little bit inconsistent, or the things that compelled them to do stuff in the plot weren't as strong as I wanted them to be, but I remembered it being silly, and I remembered it not having a lot of substance in that regard, and I just love the characters characters. So while I want to recommend this, I don't know if everybody will like it, but if you want to try it, probably do the anime instead of the manga necessarily. But again, I really enjoyed this series. I'm really happy that I finished it this year. And I would hold all of those up, but I read a lot of thick books this month, so I'm not going to do that. I lastly want to talk about the two things that I'm reading at the moment. So I'm listening to the audiobook for The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal, and that is a historical fiction sci-fi. And then I'm also reading an advanced copy, and it doesn't come out until I believe the 6th of October, and it's The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by Victoria Schwab. And I love both of these, and I'm talking about them in a vlog, and I'm really excited to talk about them in a wrap up because I'm really enjoying both. So expect to see those in a future wrap up. But as for this one, thank you so much for watching this video. Come chat with me down in the comments. Let me know if you've read any of these books, what you rated them. I would love to hear. But again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.